Hello, everyone. It's Professor Cruz again, and welcome to Module 3. In this module, we will cover the consequential ethical theories, and we are going to apply one of those theories, act utilitarianism, to the critical thinking application process that we began last week with the identification, research, and analysis assignment. So, to be clear, this is a continuation of that process. We're not starting something new, okay? And so I'm going to share my screen here with you guys, and we'll look at the module itself and see what we have going on. And then I want to get into some content for you guys. So hopefully you stay through for the whole video, because I'm going to show you some content about the consequential ethical theories. I think that'll be helpful for you. And then show you like a sample application. We'll continue on with Bob and his situation that we started last week. So as you'll see in the module, pretty familiar with what we've been doing. You're going to have your weekly discussion board. You guys did pretty good with those last week. We're getting a little better on our replies, but remember, your reply to a classmate needs to open a conversation with that classmate. If you just say, I totally agree, you did a great job, thanks for your post, that doesn't give them anywhere to respond to you. Ask them a question, engage them, get them to say something else about their position, whether you want them to strengthen it or you want to challenge it. And then remember, the finalization of this assignment is going back and replying to everyone who replied to your post, including me. So I go through and I put a question on each person. Remember, just a challenging question doesn't mean I don't like your argument, doesn't mean I'm trying to get you to change your mind. It just means I'm trying to throw something at you that makes you think about the position you took and how you would defend it. So remember, you do your initial post before Tuesday, you do your 2 replies to classmates by Thursday, and then by Saturday, you come back and respond to everyone who replied to you. So if you don't do all those aspects, you won't get the full credit. Remember, these are 50 points, so each one of these represents half a letter grade in the class, and these are designed to be easy points to get if you just do what's expected. It's kind of like contract style grading. Like, this is in the instructions, I've laid out what I want you to do, and if you do that, you meet those expectations, I'll give you the 50 points. If you don't, then I have to take away. Okay, so you do that, and then you'll want to go ahead and look at the little module information about consequential ethical theories, what we're doing this week. You take your quiz first. So you have 1 quiz up front for this one. So chapter 5, we're only covering 3 theories. They'll be covered, in that chapter. And then you have chapter quizzes 21 and 22 at the end of the week to cover like some of our social issues, right, that we're working on in between the critical thinking assignments. And so this is where my video will be, obviously, when I'm done creating it. And then these are your assignment instructions, which we'll come back to after we talk about some content stuff first. And then you'll see we have the assignment. Now, make sure you're downloading this and filling it in. Some people are sending me some stuff that isn't, in the proper formatting. You're going to lose points on that. Also, guys, remember, when you're copying and pasting it from other programs, it doesn't always articulate into Microsoft Word the same, because it's, different proprietary whatever, so the coding isn't always right. So make sure it looks good like this when you turn it in. And something that a few people have missed is I need the rubric here on the last page. If you don't have that, 1, it shows that you didn't fully read the instructions and the expectations because it mentions it. But 2, you're going to lose points because I need that to help with grading. Because what I do with these assignments, I grade it on my iPad, where I do a markup as I go. So it's like kind of like old school writing on the paper, which students have found more effective. And then I can fill your score in for you at the end. Without that, I can't do that for you, because the markup program I have, it doesn't allow you to add a page in. It just allows you to turn it into a PDF and write on it. So please be sure that you give that to me, okay? And then again, you'll get to chapter 21 Smart Book Quiz, and then your chapter 22 Smart Book Quiz, okay? So first I want to talk about just like what these consequential ethical theories are to begin with, okay? And so there's a thing I do when I talk about this with my classes face to face. I tell them about my guacamole conundrum, and yes, I like to use conundrum a lot in the ironical sense that like a lot of these things we talk about, they don't really like seem like big deals, but they can actually become big deals, right? And so, with the implication of them. So the guacamole thing. So this is a big story. I talk about how my wife and I went to Chipotle years ago before they had the mobile ordering, the pickup app, and you have to stand in line and all that stuff. And, I'm really like looking forward to the guacamole. It's kind of been, my thing I was looking forward to all day after a long day of like running errands and shopping and stuff like that. And then I get to the front and the guacamole supply is limited. And I ask for two because I want some in my bowl and I want some for chips and salsa. And the girl's like, oh, these are the last two. They're going to hate you. And I'm like, only if you tell them. It's the end of the evening. They're not really going to make more. There's some people behind me in line. But the idea is I was there. I wanted the guacamole. So I took the last two guacamoles and I go sit down, start eating. And of course, the next guy behind me wants guacamole. And she's like, he took the last two. And the guy's like, oh, man, I want some guacamole, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So now you're caught up on that situation. The guacamole, though, almost becomes like a microcosm of how we can even look at the theories themselves and they're applied and the consequential theories. So the question is, we can ask, did Mike do the right thing? Should I have taken the two guacamoles? Well, like a lot of things in this class, it's a matter of perspective and how you see it, right? And so, there's three main theories that we look at in this chapter. There's more to consequential ethical theories than these, but these are the big ones. We have ethical egoism, we have rule utilitarianism, and we have act utilitarianism. And so in ethical egoism, egoism it kind of gets a bad rap. We'll talk about that in a minute, but like people hear ego and they think psychological egoism where like we're all running around selfish and stuff. But in ethical egoism, it means we make the decision that's in our own like best long-term self-interest, even if it comes at the expense of others. So this is me taking two guacamoles, right? Now, some people say, how's that long-term interest? This is admittedly a bit of an oversimplification of the theories. It's a little bit of a stretch, but just bear with me here because it helps give us a good starting point. But then I always joke and say that sometimes I have gout flare-ups and that, guacamole is good for like, lowering the uric acid buildup so it doesn't feel like someone's driving an ice pick through my toe and then everybody starts to feel sympathetic for me. They're like, oh, it's okay, right? Like, so, like, if we just look at it that way, like, I need these, it's going to be in my long term interest, whatever. So I take two. And act utilitarianism is kind of the other extreme. So I'm going to go there first. Act utilitarianism, we make the decision that provides the greatest good for the most amount of people involved, even if it comes at our own expense. Now, this is the theory that we're going to be using this week in our application. So we're going to be looking at how can our stakeholder make or decision maker make the most people happy. So how can I make the most people happy other than myself in this situation? This is me taking no guacamoles. Now I know people are already sitting there like, well, that's not fair. You want some guacamoles. But remember, as an act utilitarian, I wake up in the morning and I say, how do I make the most people happy without, thinking about myself necessarily first? It's like I don't take guacamoles, right? Because like two people other than me can get guacamole. The lady doesn't have to deal with the angry customer right away. So like there's a lot of way that I can create some happiness, some good. Now the version of utilitarianism that people usually like a little bit better, this is rule utilitarianism. This is it's like a almost kind of like a balance. And this is where we're looking to make a decision that creates an aggregate good, like a good in the total, right? For the most amount of people involved. So this is a balance of happiness. So like then you as a stakeholder, you get to get a little bit of happiness as well too, right? So this would be me taking one guacamole, right? So I could take one for myself, create some happiness for me, create some happiness for others by leaving one behind. So like this is a way that we could look at. So, if we were like running the critical thinking application thing and we were trying to come up with options, I could take 2 guacs, 1 guacs, 0 guacs, right? Or, I like to, it's kind of funny, like is this example, but I don't see it out of the realm per se. If I were a true act utilitarian, I could drive to Sam's Club, buy a 5-pound tub of guacamole and dole it out with a lunch lady potato scooper for anyone who wanted some. I've had a colleague of mine kind of challenge this before because I think they thought I was kind of like poo pooing on act utilitarianism. And I was like, no, but like that's not realistic. I go, yeah, it might be more than what like society would require, but like again, if I put myself in the shoes of a person who wakes up in the morning and thinks, how can I create the most happiness? This is something that's well within my means. I got the money to buy the guac. I've got the Sam's Club membership. It's not super far from where we were. So yeah, I could actually do that and create an overall happiness for everybody if the issue were people want guacamole and they can't. Now, some people say, oh, it's up to the restaurant and this and that. Maybe, but again, at the end of the night, they're not going to make a whole batch for a couple of people to have, guacamole. So what could I do if I wanted to solve the situation? Now, this is where it gets interesting because in consequential ethical theories, we don't create any hard, fast moral rules. Consequential theories means the consequence or the outcome dictates whether or not we did good or bad. So that means you can lie, you can cheat, you can steal, you might even be able to kill if you can show that it provides a greater happiness for everyone involved. So, like I usually say in the classroom, like let's say I convince you that one of your classmates is a serial killer, and you all think that this is a serial killer, this guy deserves to be punished, and you want to be protected from him. So I execute him. I'm the authority figure in charge. As long as you guys think that justice was served and you feel safer in the community and you're happier, it doesn't matter that he actually wasn't a serial killer. Because his one life that we took actually created a greater happiness for everybody else. Now, again, that's an extreme example, but that's the way that works. So, like, you can lie if it creates a greater good. In fact, Plato calls it the noble lie, right? Plato's not necessarily in the consequential theories, but like you came before. But, the idea is if a lie creates a good for everybody, then that's okay. Because remember, it's the consequence, not the actions themselves that are under examination for the good or the bad, right? And so if you don't like that, then you're just not a consequentialist. So hang on to the next section of the course, but this is what we're working with this week, right? So what you do when you're testing actions or options for your application project, you act as if the outcome will work and be successful. So like let's say I had a thing that said like, Bob should lie to Tina, whoever these people are, right? Well, we operate on the assumption if the lie is successful, what will the outcome be? And then we're like, okay, we're going to do that. Now the problem is the consequence will tell us if we did good or bad, but that's kind of the nature of it. I try a thing. If it turns out good, I did good. If it turns out bad, I did bad. But we don't necessarily focus on the actions on how we got there. I hope that makes sense. So why do I bring this up now? Since it's kind of situational, which there is a whole thing called situational ethics where like when the information changes, we might make a different decision today than we made yesterday. But some people say that doesn't really amount more to than like moral relativity, which we kind of saw in chapter 1. And so if like the decision could change all the time, like is anything really constant? If there's an underlying action, that's good or bad, isn't it always good or bad? And we can make an argument either way for that, and some of us will and kind of already have with the first discussion, right, that we have. But so, today we're talking about guacamole, but what if it was the last 2 packages of toilet paper in the great TP shortage of 2020. Remember COVID, and everyone thought they were going to be locked in their house and not be able to get toilet paper, and so they had to get 168 toilet papers for 2 people. That like rolls, for 2 people in their house. What if it was the last 2 cases of water during hurricane season? What if it's the last 2 containers of baby formula? A few years back, there was a baby formula shortage, if you all recall, right? And so now this gets a little tricky because, you start to look at the outcome as more important than the action, because the underlying moral action, here, and this is something we focus on next week with non-consequential, is like, I'm taking the last of something, whatever it is. Do we like that action in general, right? Well, this week in consequential ethical theories, I'm thinking, well, it's the consequence, the outcome. So, like, I take 2 guacamoles and I don't mind. I don't have shame in it. I know some of you are going to judge me on that, and that's your right to do so. But it's just guacamole. This isn't life or death. Like, no one's going to, cease to exist because I took the guacamole. But in the 2020, when the toilet paper was short, I did not overbuy toilet paper because I know what it's like to need toilet paper and not have it. The last place you're going to catch me during hurricane season is in a Publix getting mobbed for, cases of water. You know what I mean? I was a Boy Scout and a Florida boy. Like, I fill mason jars and put them in the refrigerator, and that's my fresh water, during a hurricane. I'm not going to go out and get plastic bottles so I can have them disposable. I don't need that, right? I do not have a child, but if I did, I mean, my obligation then is to whom? My child, right? So, like, maybe I'm tempted to take those 2 baby formula things so I can, like, feed my kid, because that's at the end of the day who I'm responsible for. Now, maybe there's some sympathetic mothers in the group who know what it's like and would share, like, this is where it becomes personal to each of us, but these are how the situation can dictate how we go, and when we're really just thinking about what's the outcome, what's the consequence, right? So that's that question: does what we find permissible change with the situation, or do we stay true to our decisions? And that's true for anything we're going to talk about this semester, right? So when we talk about consequential ethical theories, let's kind of go through a page here real quick. These are the theories that base morality on the results or the outcomes of behaviors. So if that's the case, how do we evaluate our actions? It's very simple. If we had a good outcome, it was a good action, regardless of what it was. If it was a bad outcome, we had a bad action. That's it. And so does it matter what the action is? No. Outcomes are all that matters. Period. Okay? So, like, put that in your mind when you're thinking about this. It does not matter what we did. It matters what we produced and if we created happiness. And that's what they're really focused on. You'll see it. It's like happiness, it's pleasure, it's utility. Like in the chapter, all those words are interchangeable. Okay? Utilitarians just want to make sure people are happy. And so that's how we dictate, the outcome thing. This is like the phrase, the ends justify the means. If you've heard about the end is the goal, the means is how you got there. So the end goal can justify what we did in the process. Okay. Now, one of the knocks on this style of thinking is it's, retroactive. Like, so like you don't know until the outcome happens if it's good or bad, and then by then it's kind of like too late to evaluate if you did wrong because it's happened, right? So first we have ethical egoism, and this is the view that people ought to be selfish, or at least self-interested, not like psychological egoism, like I was talking a minute ago, where like we're born selfish, but we ought to think about ourselves first, and that's okay, right? Altruism, that idea of like doing good for the sake of good without expecting anything in return, is possible, but pure altruism is immoral. Like, they think if you go around and you only think about others and not yourself, then that's bad. And so altruism is the ability to act unselfishly and from concerns of others, right? It's kind of interesting because, everybody has a little bit of egoism in us, whether we want to admit it or not. And the example I usually use in class is I asked my kind of in a joking manner. It's like, well, do any of you have a friend who you absolutely despise and you can't stand them and you hate spending time around them and they bring zero value into your life, but you stop and you think, you know what? Being my friend betters them. So I'll endure all this just because it helps them. Like, no. In most relationships, if it's a friendship or even an intimate relationship we have while we're dating somebody or a significant other, when we're not getting something of value of the relationship, we oftentimes end it, and that's fine. That's a little bit of self-serving because maybe you do make their life better, but if it's coming at the expense to you and you're not getting a benefit, a lot of us are just going to bail. And so ethical ego says that the right action in any situation is what's in the individual's best long-term self-interest. One of the guys we see is Niccolò Machiavelli. He wrote The Prince. It's a famous book on political influence. And he advises that acts of pure and sometimes ruthless selfishness for those with ambition and power. And that can be the case in politics. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of hard to get all the way to the top without, kind of ruthlessly being self-serving at times. Then we have Thomas Hobbes, who you could kind of argue is actually an early contractarian, which we'll talk about next week. But, he said humans are rational in addition to selfish. So if we're thinking clearly, it's in our best interest to work with others. Accepting some limitations on pursuing immediate interests allows people to set up rules to protect everyone. And then accepting moral restrictions frees people to attain what they really want. And then every ethical consideration are warranted not for altruism, but purely for the sake of advancing one's goals. And so self-interest is foundational for ethics and social order. Now, what does this mean? This means that we have to give up a little bit of our hedonistic primal desires to do whatever we want all the time. And that way we can safely get along in society, right? Because if we knew that we were going out into the world and other peoples could rob, kill, do whatever they want to me, right? It's gonna be hard for me to drop my guard and feel comfortable in society while I pursue my other goals. So if we understand that to get along with one another for our own interests, there are just certain things we can't do to each other and certain limitations we have to accept, and that's a good thing. We got Friedrich Nietzsche. He advocates for abandoning traditional morality altogether. He says it's more important than living a good life is ask yourself if you're living a life of self-creation. And he doesn't think that individuals should conform to ethical standards that aren't of their choosing. So in the book, you'll see he has the doctrine of the eternal return of the saint. And in this, he says, a demon visits you in your bedchamber at night while you're sleeping and says that you're doomed to relive your life in its entirety over and over for all of eternity. And if the idea of reliving your life by every moment forever scares you, he says it's because you're not living a life of your own self-creation. And if you had lived a life of your own self-creation, you should be okay with living it over and over and over. Then we have Ayn Rand. She says humans are rational egoists who ought to avoid acting in ways that would alienate you from the community or bring harm on you. Rational people avoid stealing, looting, or other brutal activities that will come back to haunt you in the long run. And egoism is compatible with living together amicably and working cooperatively. So kind of like Hobbes, you're doing it selfishly. This is why some people reject egoism, because it's I'm not going to kill you and steal your stuff because I don't want you to kill me and steal my stuff. So, yeah, maybe it's selfish in what you're thinking, but the end result is you're getting along with people. But this part about humans being rational egoists who ought to act in ways that wouldn't alienate them from the community is good, right? So even if it's self-centering, making friends with people is good. Treating others with respect is good. And sure, maybe you're expecting something in the return, and that's fine. But the idea is, human relationships are good for you, and so you should strive to have those. Now, we're going to talk about applying ethical egoism just briefly because one of the extra credit assignments is after you've finished the critical thinking application process, you can, because we're going to apply act utilitarianism and constantology. And that isn't because I think those are the best, it's just because they're the most opposite. But for an extra credit assignment, you can actually do another application with any of the other theories and see if it changes your decision or the process or whatever. So you would state your central ethical issue like we did, list all your possible options like we've done, determine the most probable consequence for each option as it would, affect the decision maker, because we're only worried about the decision maker, and then apply the ethical egoist principles to choose the option that is most in your own long-term best self-interest. Now, when we talk about utilitarianism, that's kind of like an umbrella. What we ought to do morally is to produce the greatest possible utility, which is just good or happiness for the greatest number of people. So utility is good. How do we determine this? The utility principle that Jeremy Bentham talks about this. The right action in any situation is the one that tends to produce the greatest possible balance of happiness or over unhappiness for the greatest possible number. Okay? So act utilitarians, which is what you're pretending to be this week for this assignment, they say that we should apply this principle to every action we take. Rule utilitarians say we should use this principle to establish governing principles, rules, and policies. So it's not about putting it to every little decision, but almost like creating a system that we live in where this kind of ideals are embedded into everything. So Jeremy Bentham here, he is, our utilitarian guy, gets us started at a book called Principles of Legislation and Morals. He's credited with founding utilitarianism in the name, but you can find utilitarian ideals all the way back to the Stoics in Greece, well in the BC era. He advocated that changing laws of his day would create more happiness than unhappiness. He created the utility principle, which we just spoke about. He would be categorized as an act utilitarian. Now, John Stuart Mill was actually like his godson or something like that, coincidentally. He is another major founder of utilitarianism. He was England's leading philosophical voice. He served in Parliament. He advanced laws for social benefit. One of his most popular works was on the subjugation of women. He thought that laws should be amended to give women more freedom and equality under the law. So, ladies, this is your early feminist dude here helping you out. And he may have leaned towards what we call rule utilitarianism, where you create that aggregate good more than that just straight like total happiness for the group. So act utilitarianism maintains the right thing to do in any situation is the action that produces the greatest possible good for the greatest number. So how do act utilitarians figure this out? The Bentham's utility principle. Pleasure is equated with satisfaction or happiness, and we use a hedonic calculus to get to that. And that's where we just take the total planar pleasure of the results of the action that people can take and be compared by calculus or net utility. This is what we're doing this week to get the decision that our decision maker that you established in the last assignment should do. So when we apply act utilitarianism, which is what you're going to do this week, you state the central ethical issue. You list the possible options that can be taken, list all the possible people affected by these options, determine the net utility of each option. That's the most happiness it creates. And don't worry, again, if you hang to the end through the video, you're going to see a demonstration of this. And then you choose and follow the option that produces the highest net utility. Okay. Rule utilitarianism is more modified version of utilitarianism. It observes guiding human action, not just situational decisions. You want to tell us what additional rules we need for a functioning society. We're trying to create rules that if everybody followed them, we would have a happy, good society, right? Once we figure out the rules, we use them to guide our actions. People like rule utilitarianism because it seems to solve the issue of moral absolutes, but still bases moral standing of rules on what makes people happy. Because the moral absolutes is important because it's really hard to create rules for a society that everyone would follow that would create like a fair ethical society if we're like lying, cheating, stealing, killing off each other, right? So it's trying to attempt to reconcile the good ideas of active utilitarianism with non-consequential insights about moral rules and absolute moral prescription, which kind of sounds like a lot, but I might chat this up a little bit more next week because John Stuart Mill actually accused Immanuel Kant, who we're going to look at next week, of like coming up with a convoluted way to find net utility. Well, some 300, some 400 years before Mill comes along, Immanuel Kant said, we're going to establish universal moral rules that if everybody followed, we would have a fair society and that they're not going to exploit anybody, right? Now, here comes John Stuart Mills, who says, we're going to set up rules that society is going to follow to be fair and just and all that. And then we're going to make sure everybody gets a benefit in the process. I've been a professor long enough to know plagiarism when I see it, but that's a touchy subject when you bring that up with people who like John Stuart Mill versus people who like Immanuel Kant. But in academics, there is a little bit of that repeating idea, especially when a few hundred years have passed, right? But when we apply rule utilitarianism, we state our central ethical issue, we list our possible options. Then we have to list the moral rules that would be relevant in each situation, like moral rule 1, like we can't lie to each other, we can't steal from each other, we can't, blah, blah, blah. Then you're going to estimate the net utility of each rule to determine which are more likely to produce social happiness. Remember that aggregate good. Some groups might be happier or unhappier, but as long as it balances out in the middle, we like it. We're going to eliminate rules likely to result in negative net utility. And then we're going to choose the option most consistent with rules promoting social happiness. Okay, right? And I think that's the end of this slide, actually. So now let's look at what this is going to look like, for our assignment this week. So we're going to think back to our guy, Bob, and his wife who's cheating on him that I showed you in the previous video, and we're going to pick up from there. Okay? So now we're going to do applying active utilitarianism. So we're going to, when we take that chart that we made last week, we're going to keep the same chart where we have the stakeholders down one side, and then we have the decisions across the top. What we're going to do is we're going to eliminate the how people are affected parts that we put in from each box. That was just to kind of get our mentality there, right? So then we'll have this blank, inner part of the chart. We're going to add the number of people represented in each stakeholder group, and that's important. We'll talk about that in a second. Then we're going to choose a utility score for each decision and stakeholder group. Then we're going to find the net utility for each option. And then we're going to choose the option with the highest net utility. So let me show you what this looks like. So this is what this is going to look like on your assignment. This is a snapshot straight from the sample. So just fill it out and all this stuff will be there for you. You want to restate your central ethical issue in bold. So should Bob divorce his wife is mine. Yours will not be that, obviously. You want to have the happiness scale. If you're using my example, it's already there. This is our net utility scale. We want to see on a scale of +10 to -10, how happy a decision makes somebody or unhappy, right? So I've got my 4 options across the top. Bob can do nothing about his wife cheating. Bob can divorce his wife. Bob can ask his wife to go to counseling. Bob can do a trial separation from his wife. So here's my 4 options. Then I've got my stakeholders down the bottom. Bob, who's our decision maker, Mary, George, boyfriend. And for this case, since we didn't have a lot of numbers, we had a lot of ones, I went ahead and gave Timmy a sister named Sarah that we didn't have last week because it helps, because this is where I said you have to add the number of people involved in each group, okay? So a stakeholder is a person or an entity that represents groups of people. And we need to multiply whatever score we give by the amount of people in a group. Okay. So Bob, Mary, George, the boyfriend, these are all one person. So I didn't do the math because by now at this level, if you don't know that a number times one is itself, I don't know how much I can help you with math. So we don't have to show it just for the sake of showing it if we're going by one. But Timmy and Sarah are two. And that changes things. The numbers matter. And this is why we need to have that in there. Because now we multiply the score by two, and you can see that those create higher numbers. And that's what ACT Utilitarian cares about. It's like, how do we create the most amount of people happy, right? How do we make them happy? So, you could have something like a company, and that company maybe represents 1,000 people, and everybody else is like ones and twos. Well, like, if whatever makes the company the most happiest is probably going to be your winner in that case because it's 1,000 people, right? So this St. Petersburg College, if you're talking about the whole college, students and all, we're talking close to 25,000 people at any given time. So that matters for the numbers. So when you say family, like you're going to have to predict, use your own, like, logic and reason here, like how many people are in that family. When you say parents, that's at least two plural, right? And when you say, friends, how many friends? Now, what you want to do is you want to make sure you don't bias your chart. And I see this every year. People will start to realize that the numbers are going to matter. So without anything, like you guys are doing a voting thing, and they'll be like, oh, like 80,000 people for and like 10,000 people against. It's like, where'd you get that number from? Other than you just really want to slant something in your direction, right? So you want to be logical. You want to try to make some sense. You can look up some numbers if you need to, if it's like a real life thing. If not, you just, kind of put them in there. It's a little subjective because you're guessing, but you're trying to use logical guess, if that makes sense. These numbers in the chart become a little subjective at times too, because again, I'm guessing how people feel, but since I'm making the whole chart, it's relevant to me. It's more subjective if multiple people are throwing numbers on, and then we have different rating scales. But this is like when you go to the doctor, right? And they're like, what's the pain like 1 to 10? That's different for everybody. But if your doctor has seen you enough times, they will know your scale, and if that number you're giving is high or low on the scale or not. Okay. And so hopefully that makes sense. So I added this there so you could see the multiplication. So you need to do the math for multiples because it affects things. Because this isn't just a plus 10 now, it's a plus 20. And this isn't just a minus 10, this is a minus 20. So for example, like I went through, I said, well, Bob could do nothing. So I put myself, like I said last week, go to the context, think about the case, think about what people have expressed, how you think they're going to feel. Well, I'm thinking about Bob. I got a wife, I'm thinking about if I'm Bob and I, do nothing about my cheating, I'm going to feel pretty bad. -10, like knowing my wife's running around cheating on me. Mary, she might be a +2, you know what I mean? Because it's like, she's still gets to have the relationship, but like her happiness is low because now her husband knows and she knows that's awkward. Maybe that could be a negative, maybe that couldn't be, but since she was actively engaging in the affair, I'm kind of thinking maybe she is pushing towards that. I'm done with Bob, right? Maybe George feels pretty happy because he's not he doesn't feel like he directly broke up the family with this information. Boyfriend's pretty happy because he can keep seeing Mary, but now it's kind of out there, so maybe that limits his happiness a little bit. Now, Timmy and Sarah, this is where I said, remember, act as if, what's the implication of it? So if Bob cheats on if Mary's cheating on the wife, and Bob doesn't do anything, these kids don't know anything, and if life was great before, life is still great today. You see, so that's why I gave them a 10. This is their best case scenario because, like, to them, they're still kids having a good time. They don't know anything's going on with mom and dad. So as long as they can live in that reality, they're pretty happy. So what I did is once I got the score for each one, I totaled it up and I got to +28. And I'm not going to go through each one, but you can pause the screen and kind of look at it. And you can see, I came up with some numbers and I got -19, -5, -16. So when I go to make my decision, I look to the act utility chart and I say, if Bob were an act utilitarian, he would do nothing about his wife cheating. Now, I know there's probably a lot of you sitting there right now pretty upset with that decision. Just means you're not an act utilitarianism, but it doesn't mean it's not the correct decision under this theory. Remember, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people involved. And Bob, despite the fact that he's the one most directly affected by this affair, he has to think as an act utilitarian, how do I create the greatest amount of good for the most amount of people? Well, the greatest happiness for everybody involved is for him to just do nothing and not upheave the system. A lot of people don't like that because this means, Bob has to sit there and be a cuckold, right? And I know that somebody's going to giggle or be shocked when I said that, but like before the internet took it over as a weird, slang or whatever, it was a word Shakespeare brought up, it just means Bob his wife is knowingly in a relationship with another man. He's not doing anything about it. So a lot of people would feel bad that we've put Bob in this situation where he has to take that kind of abuse to make everybody else happy, but that's the theory, right? It's extreme. If you don't love it, that just means you're not an act utilitarian. That's fine, right? You'll find a theory that you like, but some people are going to like it because, ultimately too, he doesn't have to overreact because plenty of marriages have survived infidelity, right? And so, does he need to knee-jerk react? Who knows? But as an act utilitarian, this is what he would do. Does that make sense? Now, you're going to go do that yourself. You're going to do it the same way, applying it to your theory, right? So, or to your case. And so, when we go back out here, when we look at the assignment, like I said, we'll go backwards a little bit here. Canvas is a little weird about when you're trying to backtrack in the modules. You either go back or have to enter the whole class again, right? So, you read through and it says that you're going to continue on, right? From the previous assignment, you're going to reread over the lesser two evils case study. And then you're going to use my example that I showed you, download it, use it, make sure you have all the parts. You're not going to use any generative AI programs to assist in the completion of this assignment. This is not to call any one particular person out, but people are already getting hit for this. And I do send people to the academic review board for remediation when caught, and you will get a 0 on your assignment. And if you get a 0 on your assignment for using generative AI, you are not allowed to earn any extra credit in the class, as you may or may not have seen in the syllabus. I take this seriously in this class because this class is ethics. If there's one class where you shouldn't cheat and you need to do the right thing, it's literally this class, okay? Also, this class, the main reason why it's a required class for every student is because of its promotion of critical thinking. Right now, in its current form and our understanding of it, generative AI programs is the exact opposite of critical thinking. The copy leaks report, I see it when it goes through. You'll see it after grading. And then when I, send you a message to say, hey, I got some questions, that means, we've got you, cooked on the report, man. Like it's shown we got a problem and we need to talk about it, okay? So let's avoid that. And by avoid that, I mean just like straight up don't do it. Let's avoid that. I think it's far too passive. You need to hear me. Like, don't do it. Don't try me on it, okay? Please. I don't like doing it. I don't like having to write these reports and get people, on the board and all that, but I will. It is my job, so I have to do that, okay? So when you apply it, this is kind of like what we talked about with the chart, then what you're going to do when you get your answer from the chart, your decision in at least 150 words, one good paragraph. You're going to start it off with, if so-and-so were an act utilitarian, whoever your decision maker is, they would do blah, 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 and write it out. Then in the rest of that paragraph, you need to show, how you use the theory to get there and how this aligns with the theory. So what I'm asking you to do in that situation is I'm asking you to use paraphrasing from the book about the theory. And I want to see a couple things. Don't just say, oh, this aligns because you're creating the greatest amount of good for the most amount of happiness in Manus Monroe, right? That's generic. Yes, we know that. That's a very surface level, okay? And you'll see me make commentary in your paper, like you got to get off the surface level, dig deep. So show me a couple things that show that A, you understand how the theory is applied, and B, how this um, decision fits in that theory, right? Now, for act utilitarianism, you can only have one answer. You cannot have multiple answers. If you have a tie, you got to go back and fix something because you can't create the greatest amount of happiness in two different ways. There's only one greatest, right? So make sure you do that, and then you have your little paragraph explaining it. Make sure you go through your submission checklist. Then make sure you have everything done before you do it. You're using your APA 7th edition standards. Remember, guys, we have a module dedicated just for this. This is why I brought you on there on the syllabus scavenger hunt thing. So like this is the citation guide, right? So like this will show you what citations should look like. So we're doing a book, with two authors, right? It's got the example here and it's got the rules for setting stuff up, for multiple authors, book titles and stuff like that. So use that. Then we've got the thing for the citation. All the information that you need for the citation for the book is on the front matter page of your textbook. So when you go to the table of contents, you see front matter. It'll show you all the stuff, except for the year, because it's digital. The year is 2022. I'm giving it to you here. We'll see who watches the video. Also, you can find all the information in the syllabus under the course textbook with the year and everything. So the information is there. You just need to structure it into the appropriate way. Okay. And then you use the in-text citations. We'll see who else is listening to the video. So the in-text citation is Manus, ampersand, Monroe, comma, 2022. And then that'll kick back to how your book is, but you'll see you need to have the full reference citation for the textbook on your references page, like in my example. If you do not cite the stuff properly, I won't be able to grade it. I'll send it back to you to be fixed first, because in good faith, being an ethics class, I can't grade something that has plagiarism in it, even if it's unintentional, right? So I believe that's it for now. Thanks for bearing with me. If you're at the end of this video, I don't know the time. I'm not really watching it. I'm sure it was kind of long. But what I like to do in, the face-to-face class, or the online class, I like to humanize it as much as possible. This is why I do the screen share. This is why I show myself while I'm talking. So that way, that there's a real live person on the other end of this thing. And I'm explaining to you the same stuff that you get in the classroom as an abbreviated version, I know. But I know sometimes in the online, it feels like you're getting everything yourself and you're just reading the book and doing assignments. So I like to give you this resource for you to use and to watch as many times as you need to, and kind of maybe just help explain the assignment to you and stuff like that. But as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, reach out. Don't feel like you got to do it on your own. But hopefully this video helps get you where you need to be on this assignment. And then I'll see you next week for our video on non-consequential theories. You guys take care.